Do you want more braking power, better modulation, or do you want your brakes to stop fading on long descents? If so, then this video is for you. But not all of these issues will be solved by just simply buying a set of new brakes. So stick with me to the end of this video as I'm going to explain the differences. And big thanks to Shimano for supporting this video and also providing me with a couple of sets of pads, discs and brakes so that I can show you which products fix which issues so you don't have to spend more money than you need to in the future. Now, it's a really good idea to check your system is in perfect working order before you start spending money on upgrades, because it's very easy for things like power to degrade over time, and it might happen so slowly that you don't even notice it. So if you want help checking your system, then head into the studio with me now and I'll show you what to look out for. But if you're confident that your system is in perfect working order, then you can skip along the timeline to step 2, where we diagnose the problems. Make sure your brakes have been recently serviced or bled, because regular bleeding of the brakes will remove air bubbles, which can cause inconsistencies in the power of your brakes. You may start to feel that they're quite spongy. Perhaps the levers go all the way to the bars, and that's where you're definitely losing performance. If you start bleeding your brakes and you find that the oil coming out is now a slightly blackened color, then that means that the oil in the system is now either contaminated or it's degraded over time, and that will also lose you power. So it might be time for a full bleed and replace all of the fluid in that system with some new stuff. Check your rotors for any damage, so you're looking for scratches or scuffs or any bends so that the disc is no longer straight, as this will cause inconsistencies in the power and performance of your brakes. Also, check for any discoloration, as this may suggest that your discs have been scorched or glazed and it won't provide adequate friction for good stopping power. Regularly remove your disc brake pads and have a good look at them to make sure that they're in good condition, there's not loads of mud or contaminants on the pad, and when they're cleaned up, make sure that the surface isn't overly shiny, which suggests that they've been glazed or scorched as well, and they won't give you good friction on the discs. Also, your pads and your discs need to be a minimum width to operate properly. So most discs, at least, will have the width written on the side. So the Shimano disc has a minimum requirement of 1.5 millimeters. So we can measure that with a caliper and just make sure that there is still enough disc there to perform adequately. So with these brake pads, the minimum amount of pad that you require is actually 0.5 millimeters. Now that's just the pad, not including the backing plate. So you can eye this up with some calipers or a flat-ended metal ruler, or you can measure the entire pad and then just subtract the amount of the backing plate. If you feel like your brakes have been poor from the start, now be honest with yourself, did you bed them in properly? Because this is a really important part of the process to get the most from your brakes. Now, the bedding in process is designed to allow some of the pad material to be deposited into the microscopic pores on the disc rotor, and that combination of the two materials will cause enough friction to stop. If you haven't done this process properly, then you won't get the most power out of your brakes. So think about doing this process again. Check your pads. If they're glazed, if they're not working well, then you might have to think about either resurfacing both or buying yourself some new pads at the very least and going through the bedding in process again. However, I will say if you are changing pads from one material to the other, then this process needs to be started all over again, not just because you have new pads, but because if you've deposited resin material on your rotors, for example, then swapping over to sintered means that the two materials are now opposing. So you effectively want to either resurface your discs or think about getting new discs so that they match with your new pad material. And finally, and this is a little bit advanced, but if you've had your brakes for a while, it's a good idea to check the pistons in your calipers. Now, you'll need to remove your pads, and you may need a special tool to check and service the pistons, as this will allow you to isolate pistons individually so that you can check each of them are moving, and so that you can also access each one of them and lubricate them with the fluid from your braking system. Now, you can buy specialist tools for this, or you can get yourself a brake bleeding block and file down a few millimeters of one side so that only isolates one. Okay, let's head back to the trail and diagnose a few problems on your brakes and figure out what we need in order to fix them. Okay, so your brakes are in perfect working order, but you're still not satisfied with the performance, in which case it might be time for a few upgrades. However, the upgrades that you choose will depend on what problem you're trying to fix, because there's no point buying a new set of levers and calipers if the issue you're trying to solve is within poor heat management in your rotors. So ask yourself these few questions. Do you dislike the feel of your brakes? Would you like more modulation, which means a more smooth and controlled stop rather than something that's overly sharp and aggressive? To change the feel of your brakes rather than, say, the power, you'll need to be looking at different pad materials. So if this is definitely your issue, then head over to step 3 and I'll explain this in more detail. So are your brakes fine at the start of a ride, or perhaps at the start of a descent, but they get progressively worse, particularly on long descents? This is known as brake fade, and it comes from your braking system getting overly hot. So there's a number of products on the market, from finned pads to finned rotors, that can help cool down the system. Shimano even offer different materials in their rotors to help draw heat away from the system. So to understand this a bit more, head over to step 4. Are your brakes stopping you in time, or do you need more power? So more power can usually be had from bigger rotors or bigger calipers. So head over to step 5 to understand your options a bit better. So changing the bite or the modulation in your braking system is usually a friction thing, and that can largely be controlled by the material in your brake pads. Now, there's 2 main types of brake pads. There's metal or sintered, or there's organic or resin. Now, metal is obviously made up from metal shavings, but the resin or organic pads are made up of organic fibers that are bonded together with resin. Now, that is a much softer material than metal or sintered, and that allows the resin pads to conform around the shape of the rotor better, and that can give you a more progressive braking feel and more control over how much braking you have, which means more modulation. So if you have sintered already and you want more modulation, then you may want to consider moving over to organic or resin pads. Now, you can actually resurface discs, but I don't like to recommend it if you're not comfortable doing this process, as you could scratch or damage your rotors. So what I like to do is to keep my sintered rotors with my sintered pads, perhaps for the winter or when it's wet. And then if I'm changing over to resin, I'll get a new set of rotors to mesh in with those resin pads, and I'll keep those together and maybe change them back over to my other rotors in the winter. If you are suffering from brake fade, that means that the power is fading over time. Usually we find this on long descents, and it's as a result of heat building up in the system, and this heat inhibits the friction and therefore inhibits the power in your braking system. Now, there's 3 types of fade. There is mechanical fade, there's oil fade, and there's friction fade. And usually in mountain biking, we experience friction fade. So there's a few options out there that can actually fix this problem. Let's have a look. So Shimano actually have a range of heat management products under the brand Ice Technology, and this will usually involve different materials in the backing plates of the pads and different materials in the rotors as well in order to draw heat out of the system. So these are a set of entry-level sintered pads, and they have a steel backing plate there. Now these are Ice Technology sintered pads, and as you can see, they're much longer in the backing plate and they're made of aluminium. And aluminium draws heat much better than steel, and being longer, it's drawing that heat out of the system or out of the caliper. So this is your entry-level steel rotor, and this is Shimano's Ice Technology rotor, and it differs because the material here is actually a 3-layer sandwich of aluminium in the center and steel and stainless steel on either side, and the aluminium works to draw heat from the disc to radiate it into the atmosphere, and according to Shimano, this actually reduces the system heat buildup by 100 degrees C, which is huge. Now, if that isn't enough for you, you can actually take it further with the Ice Technology freezer. Now, this rotor, as you can see, it looks quite different because of the fins in the center. Now, this is similar in that it has that 3-layer construction, but the aluminium in the center has been further drawn into the center of the rotor to further draw the heat into the atmosphere and out of the caliper. And these fins are black, as you can see here, and that's not just for aesthetics. That is a proper heat management paint, which further reduces heat by another 10 degrees, which means that if you were to choose Ice Technology freezer rotors over standard stainless steel rotors, you could get over 150 degrees C reduction in heat. So that's huge. For more power, the first thing you want to do is increase your rotor size if you haven't already. So if you were to have a bigger disc, that gives you more power because it gives you more leverage. And the reason it does this is because that surface that you're braking with is further away from the axle, gives you more leverage. Much like if you were to have a bigger tool to work on, it would have more leverage than a smaller one. Now, I've actually done another video on changing rotor sizes, and I moved from 180 up to 200 up to 220, and that was with just basic stainless steel rotors and 2-piston calipers actually. So that proved that I could get more power on a budget just by changing the rotor sizes. But if you've upgraded your rotor size and you definitely feel like you want more power, you can't go far wrong with getting yourself something like the Shimano Saint brakes, which are designed for downhill. And these things will be perfectly adequate for enduro and trail too. So let me explain the differences between, say, a downhill brake and an entry-level brake. Now, the first thing you may get with your entry-level system is 2 pistons, so a piston on either side to push the pads into the disc. Now, something like a downhill caliper will have 4 pistons in there, and more pistons means more strength, but also it means that you can have a bigger pad, and a bigger pad means more friction on the rotor, and more friction means more power to stop. Now, in a high-end caliper like the Shimano Saint, you usually get ceramic pistons. Now, ceramic as a material inhibits the heat building up in the system. That means less fade and more consistent power. And the Shimano Saints also have their signature gold anodized extra long banjo hose, which means when the caliper builds up with heat, it then draws it out and away, and it doesn't transmit it to the hose, which will contain oil. And if that heats up, then you get brake fade from the oil heating up as well. And as you can see, the Saint caliper is much bigger, much chunkier than the entry-level caliper. And it's not just down to the fact that this is a 4-piston and it's housing more stuff, it's also made much chunkier, much more rigid, so that there's no flex in the system, because flex would deliver inconsistent power. So you're more likely to get a consistent, powerful stroke out of this bigger caliper. With a high quality brake, you will get a metal body as well, rather than plastic, although the entry-level Shimano levers are actually pretty good in this respect. But having a metal body instead of plastic just means that it will withstand all those knocks and the abuse of downhill and enduro racing. And with the Saints, they actually have much smaller levers, which is counterintuitive when it comes to power, because there's less leverage. And the Saint is so powerful, you don't actually need that much leverage from the lever itself. So as you can see, the Saint actually has a much smaller lever to control the amount of power delivery. And one last benefit to a high-end braking system, or a high-end braking lever at least, is getting free stroke and reach adjustment on your lever. So reach is usually the big dial on the outside, which controls how close or how far away the lever is to your bars, so that you can set it up into a comfortable position under your finger. And then free stroke just changes where the bite point actuates. So you might want it to be quite soon, or you might want it to be quite later. And that sort of customization is left for the higher end levers. And just a final word on the hoses, because you can upgrade to braided hoses. And these sort of braided steel hoses are often used in the motor world, because steel is much stronger, so it will resist the flex in the hose, which could cause inconsistencies in power, but also it could create that spongy feel like you get when you get air in your system. But on a mountain bike system, it is quite a small system, so it's debatable whether you would notice that kind of loss of power, but there may be some extra gains to be had. However, I would say a better investment, other than the brakes and the products I've talked about in this video, is getting yourself a good set of tires, because it's no good having a really powerful set of brakes if your tires aren't even digging into the ground. Well, hopefully that's gone a long way to explaining what all these different products do and how they may help you with your braking problems in the future. Anyway, enough talking about brakes. I'm going to go off and use them. But don't forget to like this video if you want to see more in-depth videos like this in the future. Thanks for watching.